My name is Samson, and my hands are stained with the blood of men I never wish to harm. For 2 years I have been forced to kill for the amusement of those who sit in silks and diamonds, sipping champagne while they wager on how long a slave can cling to life. They call it gladiator nights. I call it a carnival of death. Every scar on my body is a record of the battles I never chose. 15 men have fallen beneath my spear, men who looked at me not as an enemy but as a brother caught in the same snare. We were ordered to fight each other, stripped of dignity, stripped of choice, while our masters clapped and cheered from the bleachers. Madame Evangelene Tibido, the woman who presided over it all, called herself a patroness of the art. She said her arena was civilization's gift to the Louisiana bayou. But what kind of art is built on the cries of men forced to kill their kin? What kind of civilization feeds its guests the sight of blood as though it were wine? At first I fought because I had no choice. The punishment for refusal was worse than death. Men who resisted were torn apart by alligators, their screams echoing through the swamp at night. So I learned to strike fast, to survive one fight at a time, even as guilt burned holes through my soul. But then something changed. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim and began to see myself as a weapon I could one day turn against those who treated me like an animal. The killing they forced on me became the training I would use to kill them instead. I was not alone in this thought. Marcus, my oldest friend, fought beside me in those pits. He was as large and unbreakable as an oak tree. And each night after the matches, when we were tossed back into our cages with our wounds still bleeding, we whispered about the day we would ride. He had a saying he repeated like a prayer: "Better to die free than live as a slave." Those words burrowed into me, shaping every thought, every breath, until they became my truth as well. Others began to share our whisper. Rebecca, the quiet house servant, who had spent years pouring wine into the goblets of the white guests, agreed to help when the time came. Benjamin, the carpenter who had built the arena stands with his own hands, knew the weak places in the timber and where to set fire. Sarah, whose husband and son had been forced to fight each other to the death, carried grief sharp enough to cut through steel. She did not want freedom only for herself. She wanted vengeance. We planned for months in secret, every gathering disguised as simple slave talk, every signal hidden in plain sight. Rebecca offered her knowledge of herbs and poisons. She could make the guests' wine into venom. Benjamin mapped the escape routes through the swamps. Marcus and I would be the spectacle, the final match that Madame Evangeline had carefully arranged as the climax of her anniversary celebration. She thought she was setting us against each other, but she had unknowingly given us the perfect stage. Still, on the night before the rebellion, doubt whispered in my mind. What if we failed? What if our plan ended with more blood spilled in the sand, our bodies left for the alligators while our masters laughed one last time? That night we gathered in the shadows, a circle of 50 men and women bound by desperation and rage. We spoke not with shouts but with whispers, our voices weaving a tapestry of resolve. Rebecca asked the question none of us wanted to face. What happens after? If we succeed, what then? Her words fell heavy. I told her the truth as I saw it. Then we scatter, into the swamps, into the forests. Some of us will be hunted down, some will make it north, maybe even to Canada. But at least the world will know we are not property, we are not entertainment. We are men and women who can strike back. Marcus nodded, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the firelight. Better to die free than live as slaves, he repeated. A low murmur of agreement spread through the group, voices steady with the sound of people who had nothing left to lose. By the time the meeting ended, I felt something strange. Peace. For years I had been chained to violence, forced to kill for others. Tomorrow I would kill again, but for the first time the blood would have meaning. Justice, freedom, revenge. I lay awake long after the others had gone, listening to the sounds of the bayou. The frogs croaked, the alligators splashed, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a whip cracked, and I imagined Madame Evangeline laughing as she prepared her guests for their grand evening of entertainment. She thought the slaves of Tibido plantation were broken. Tomorrow night, she would learn how wrong she was. Friday, October 13th, 1853. The date branded itself into my soul. The night the hunters would become the hunted. The night the entertainers would turn the audience into the show. The night blood would no longer flow for their amusement, but for our liberation. The evening of October 13th descended like a velvet curtain, heavy with tension only I could feel. From my place near the slave quarters, I watched the Tibido plantation transform into a theater of cruelty one last time. Carriages rattled up the circular drive, their lanterns glowing like fireflies against the twilight. Judges, senators, sugar barons, and their perfumed wives stepped down from polished steps, wrapped in silks and dripping with jewels. They moved with the careless arrogance of people, convinced the world existed solely for their pleasure. The arena gleamed in the flickering torchlight. Garlands of Spanish moss draped across the timber stands, candles set into iron sconces. To any outsider, it might have seemed festive, almost beautiful. But for those of us who lived in its shadow, every timber was soaked with memory. Every plank had been laid with Benjamin's hands. Every stain in the sand was the blood of a slave whose life was thrown away for sport. Servants, my brothers and sisters, moved silently through the crowds, offering champagne on silver trays. Their eyes lowered to avoid the sting of a master's gaze. But I noticed the subtle signs, the almost imperceptible nods and glances. Rebecca passed among them, pouring wine into crystal goblets with a hand steady enough to hide the truth. Some glasses carried a bitter secret, poison, enough to still the breath of men who had never known fear in their lives. And then came Madame Evangeline. She glided through the torchlight, like a queen in a kingdom of misery, her gown a deep river of purple silk, her hair coiled high with diamonds that sparked against the night. She had built her reputation on cruelty masked as spectacle, and tonight she basked in the worship of her peers. They gathered around her like moths to a flame, offering their praise, laughing at her sharp wit. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called, raising her arms in theatrical welcome, "I bid you welcome to the second anniversary of Gladiator Nights." Her voice carried clear as a bell across the arena. "Tonight's tournament will surpass all you have seen before. And to honor our anniversary, I offer the greatest of prizes. A victor's freedom." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers rattling the bleachers, but I knew better. There was no freedom on this plantation, only another layer of torment disguised as hope. No one who entered Madame Evangeline's arena ever left alive, save for those dragged back in chains to fight again. But tonight, her lies no longer mattered. Tonight, our freedom would not be granted. It would be taken. The first match began as torches flared high, shadows stretching long across the sand. Two field hands, borrowed from a neighboring plantation, were shoved into the circle and handed crude spears. They fought with a desperation born of terror, circling each other under the watchful eyes of men who had wagered gold on who would fall. The fight lasted nearly half an hour before one drove his spear into the other's chest. The crowd roared with approval as the body was dragged across the sand to the waiting platform, where alligators thrashed in the swamp's black water. I watched from the holding pen beneath the stands, my pulse hammering. Around me, other fighters sat in silence, some praying, others staring hollow-eyed at nothing. They had no idea that tonight would end differently, that the circle of death built to consume us would instead become the grave of our oppressors. The second match cut deeper than the first. Madame Evangeline had paired brothers against one another, her appetite for cruelty boundless. When they hesitated, circling each other with grief carved into their faces, she rose from her chair with cold impatience. "Fight," she snapped, her voice slicing through the night, "or I'll feed you both to the swamp." The brothers obeyed, blades clashing with a fury that was as much despair as strength. The younger's knife found the elder's chest at last, and his scream of grief echoed louder than the cheers of the guests. He crumpled over his brother's body, sobbing as the crowd applauded their entertainment. I clenched my fists until my nails cut into my palms. Every drop of blood spilled tonight only sharpened the edge of our resolve. Then through the sea of faces I saw her, Ruth. She drifted between guests with her tray of champagne, her steps smooth, her expression carefully blank. But when our eyes met across the torchlight, she gave the smallest nod. The signal. The wine was ready, the weapons were in place. Our night had come. 2 more matches followed, bodies dragged into the swamp, the crowd's hunger for violence swelling with each death. By the time the 4th fight ended, the bleachers trembled with applause, the air thick with the stink of blood and sweat and wine. And then at last the moment arrived. Marcus and I were led into the arena, our chains unhooked, our weapons pressed into our hands. The crowd rose in thunderous excitement, their shouts crashing down like waves. To them we were gladiators, enemies destined to carve each other apart for their delight. Madame Evangeline rose in her box, her eyes glittering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she cried, her voice ringing with triumph, "the champion Samson faces Marcus, the challenger, in tonight's grand finale. Place your bets, for only one will leave this circle alive." The noise was deafening. They had no idea that they were cheering for their own doom. Marcus and I circled each other in the sand, playing our roles, spears raised high. I saw confusion flicker across the faces in the stands as we hesitated, neither willing to strike. And then in that heartbeat of silence, I lifted my spear high above my head. Now I roared. The word thundered across the arena, and from the shadows the night erupted into chaos. The arena exploded. The instant my cry left my throat. For a split second, the crowd thought it was part of the act, some dramatic flourish to heighten their amusement. But when Marcus spun on his heel and drove his spear into the chest of a guard instead of me, the illusion shattered. The man fell with a strangled cry, his musket clattering to the sand. The bleachers gasped, laughter collapsing into stunned silence. Then the torches flickered with movement as my brothers and sisters rose from their forced servitude. Servants dropped trays, shattering crystal and spilling poisoned wine across the polished wood. Rebecca's steady hands tipped goblet after goblet into greedy mouths, her face calm as death while the first of the guests began to sway. It had begun. Marcus tore the spear free, whirling to face the nearest overseer. I ripped the chain still dangling from my wrist and swung it like a whip, the iron links cracking across another man's skull. He dropped where he stood, his blood dark against the pale sand. The crowd erupted, not in cheers but in screams. Silk-skirted women scrambled up the stands, their jewels scattering as they tripped over their own hems. Men shouted, some fumbling for pistols, others clutching their throats as the poison began its merciless work. The air filled with confusion, fear, and the copper scent of blood. Above it all I saw her, Madame Evangelene. She had risen from her box, her jeweled hands gripping the railing as she stared down in disbelief. For the first time in all the years I had known her, the mask of control cracked across her face. "Seize them," she shrieked, her voice raw with fury, but her order came too late. Rebecca had struck first blood among the masters, plunging a concealed blade into the ribs of a senator as he staggered from his seat. Ruth followed, slipping a knife from her garter and cutting down a judge who reached for her arm. Around the arena, others joined, slaves who had waited for this night with clenched teeth and silent prayers. Their chains became weapons, their rage the fuel of their courage. Marcus and I fought back to back, his spear flashing in the torchlight, my chain whipping through the air with each swing. A guard lunged at me, bayonet aimed for my chest. I caught the blade in the chain's coil, yanked it free and drove it through his throat. His scream drowned in the roar of the uprising. The stands had become a battlefield. The poisoned drinkers fell to their knees, clutching at their bellies, their faces twisting with panic as they realized their own indulgence had damned them. Those who remained unpoisoned tried to flee, but the exits were already claimed by our people. The gates that had once held us in now became walls keeping them trapped. A woman in pearls shrieked as Ruth shoved her into the pit where the alligators waited. Her scream was cut short by the thrash of water and the snap of jaws. Some of the crowd tried to leap from the stands into the swamp, only to vanish beneath the murky surface. Their laughter had filled that swamp for years. Now it would devour them whole. I caught sight of Benjamin through the chaos, the overseer who had once chained me to the whipping post. He staggered backward, his face pale as parchment, before he turned and ran toward the stables. I let him go. His time would come. Tonight was for blood, but his death would be slowed, deliberate, remembered. The roar of combat swallowed everything. Shots rang out, screams cut through the night, bodies tumbled into the sand. Marcus fought like a man possessed, his spear striking with the certainty of one who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. Each life he claimed was another chain broken, another ghost avenged. At the far end of the arena, Rebecca and Ruth had armed themselves with pistols stripped from fallen men. Smoke curled from the barrels as they fired into the panic, their faces lit by torchlight, their eyes hard as steel. The air itself seemed to shake with the fury of centuries unleashed in a single hour. For every master that fell, the cry rose louder, an unspoken chorus, a hymn of vengeance. Madame Evangelene screamed again from her box, her voice hoarse with rage. She had not yet fled. Pride or madness kept her rooted, but even she must have seen the tide was irreversible. Her empire was crumbling before her, the very stage she had built for her amusement becoming the place of her undoing. I dragged my chain through the sand, my chest heaving, my body slick with sweat and blood that was not my own. Around me, the dead lay sprawled in silks and uniforms alike, their jewels scattered like worthless trinkets in the dirt. And still the fight raged on. One by one, torches were knocked from their posts, shadows spreading across the arena as fire licked at the timbers. The night filled with smoke, screams, and the stench of burning flesh. The bleachers trembled under the weight of struggle, the world itself seeming to shift. At last the poisoned men collapsed in droves, their bodies twitching before falling still. The crowd had thinned to chaos, and in its place we stood, not slaves, not gladiators, but soldiers. I lifted my chain high, the iron links dripping red. This night is ours. I bellowed, my voice carrying through the smoke and flame, and in answer 100 voices rose with me, their cry tearing the heavens. Freedom, the signal had been given. The uprising was no longer a whisper or a dream, it was a storm. And nothing, not even Madame Evangeline's iron will, could silence it. The night had caught fire, literally. One of the torches, knocked from its iron sconce during the frenzy, rolled against the bleachers and caught the dry wood like tinder. Within moments, flames climbed skyward, crackling hungrily, casting the arena in a hellish glow. Smoke billowed, thick and choking, swirling above the chaos as screams turned into wails of despair. Others turned their pistols wildly, firing into the crowd. But in the smoke and madness, their bullets often struck their own kind. I moved through the sand, my chain heavy with blood, Marcus beside me, his chest heaving as though he carried a furnace within him. We were no longer two fighters staged for their amusement. We were executioners. Every step we took was a verdict. Every strike a sentence. From the stands, Ruth's voice cut through the roar. Now, drive them down. Her command was sharp as a blade, and our people obeyed. We funneled the fleeing guests into the pit, pressing them toward the swamp where the alligators waited. Their finery and their fortunes meant nothing here. Pearls snapped from necks, diamonds scattered into the mud, silks were torn and smeared with blood. The fire leapt higher, a crimson banner against the sky, as if heaven itself bore witness. Sparks rained down, hissing against the wet ground of the swamp. The bleachers groaned under the strain, the wood beginning to splinter as guests clung to them in desperation. I caught sight of Rebecca again, her gown torn at the hem, a pistol smoking in her hand. She had dragged a governor by his hair to the edge of the pit, forcing him to stare into the snapping jaws below. His pleas rose in a shrill cry promising wealth, mercy, anything to save his life. Rebecca said nothing. She only shoved him forward, and the swamp swallowed his words forever. Everywhere I turned, vengeance unfurled like a storm cloud. A woman who had once carried trays for the Tibido family now plunged a knife into the chest of the very judge who had sentenced her brother to death. A boy no older than 16 swung a torch into a planter's face, his scream of fury louder than the crackle of fire. Chains, once tools of submission, became weapons of liberation. And still in the center of it all stood Madame Evangeline. She had not fled her box. The flames painted her in orange and red, the jewels in her hair glittering as though mocking the ruin around her. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when it came, was sharp as ever. "You think you can destroy me," she shrieked. "This land, this house, this power, it will outlive you all." Her words were drowned by the crash of collapsing timber as a section of bleachers gave way, sending men and women tumbling into the arena with screams cut short by the sand. The smoke swirled around her, obscuring her figure like a specter. But I saw fear in her eyes for all her defiance. For the first time, she was the one trapped in the arena she had built. A gunshot rang out, whistling past my ear. I turned to see an overseer leveling his musket again. But Marcus was quicker. He lunged forward, driving his spear into the man's gut. The shot fired harmlessly into the sky, sparks raining down from the barrel. Marcus ripped the spear free, blood pouring into the sand, and the overseer crumpled without a sound. The fire roared higher, feeding on the very air, and the arena became a furnace. The smell of burning flesh mingled with smoke, the torches now indistinguishable from the inferno devouring the stands. The crowd's once triumphant cheers had become a chorus of terror, their laughter silenced forever. I raised my chain again, striking down a planter who tried to crawl past me on his knees. His pleading eyes searched mine, but I felt nothing. No pity, no hesitation. Only the memory of every lash, every scream, every grave dug in secret for the ones they had taken from us. My chain fell, and his skull cracked like brittle clay. Rebecca joined us at the arena floor, her face streaked with soot, her pistol empty now, but her resolve unbroken. Ruth was with her, a knife still glinting, her gown torn to ribbons. "It's done," Ruth said between breaths. "Most are dead. The rest will burn." "No," I answered, my voice low, steady. "It's not done, not until she falls." All three of us turned our gaze toward Madame Evangeline. She stood framed by smoke and flame, her eyes wide but unyielding, her teeth bared in a snarl. She clutched a pistol of her own, its barrel gleaming in the firelight. The final act was yet to come. As the fire climbed into the heavens and the swamp gnashed its jaws below, I knew the arena was no longer hers. It belonged to us, to the dead. to the centuries of pain now set ablaze. The Tibido Empire was burning, and soon its queen would burn with it. The smoke wrapped itself around the arena like a shroud, thick enough to sting my eyes and sear my throat. Still, through the haze, her figure was unmistakable. Madame Evangelene Tibido, standing defiant on the balcony of her box. She held herself as though the fire, the blood, the chaos had all been staged for her performance. Her purple gown shimmered with jewels, her pistol raised steady, her eyes burning with venom. She aimed straight at me. The crack of the shot rang out, deafening against the roar of the fire. I dropped low, the bullet whistling past my temple, close enough that I felt the heat of its path. Sand kicked up into my face as it struck the ground behind me. Marcus roared and surged forward, but I flung out a hand to stop him. She's mine. He froze, chest heaving, eyes narrowing in understanding. The others had fought, had killed, had burned, but this moment was meant for me alone. Madame Evangeline reloaded, her movements precise, despite the smoke swirling around her. Do you think this changes anything? She shouted, her voice carrying above the flames. You are nothing but beasts, and beasts die in cages. I walked slowly across the blood-soaked sand, dragging my chain behind me. Each step echoed a drumbeat against the chaos, and every survivor, slave or master, seemed to hold their breath. The firelight painted me in flickering gold and red, a shadow rising from the very pit she had created. You built this cage, I called back, my voice raw. And tonight you choke on its bars. She raised her pistol again, but her hand trembled now. The mask of command was cracking. She fired, the shot slicing through smoke, and struck Marcus instead, grazing his shoulder. He staggered but did not fall, blood blossoming on his arm. He bared his teeth in a grin, lifting his spear in salute to me. End her, he growled. I ran. The chain swung heavy in my hand as I bounded up the burning stairs, 2 at a time. Flames licked at the railing, smoke clawed at my lungs, but nothing slowed me. Madame Evangeline stepped back, her eyes darting for escape, yet pride anchored her feet. You think you can touch me? She spat, fury sharp enough to mask her fear. I am Tibido. My name will outlive you. Then let it outlive you in ashes. I hissed. I lunged, swinging the chain with all the force of every lash I'd ever endured. It wrapped around her wrist, yanking the pistol free with a crack of bone. She screamed, staggering back, clutching her shattered hand. Her jewels rattled, her diamonds gleamed, but she was nothing more than flesh and fear. I wrenched the chain free and looped it again, this time around her throat. The crowd below, our people, our fighters, even the dying remnants of her guests, watched in silence. For years they had cheered as slaves strangled one another in her arena. Now they saw their queen ensnared in the same fate. She clawed at the iron links, her eyes bulging, her voice a strangled rasp. Please! But mercy had long ago drowned in this swamp. I pulled tight. Her heels kicked against the boards, her fingers tearing at her jewels, ripping diamonds loose as if they could buy her breath back. Her eyes met mine, not with command anymore, but with pure naked terror. For Benjamin, I whispered. For everyone you fed to the pit. I wrenched the chain, and her body convulsed. Her scream cut off in a wet gurgle. The fire roared around us as her strength gave out, her jeweled crown slipping from her hair and clattering to the boards. When at last her body sagged, lifeless, I let her fall. She crashed onto the balcony floor, her purple silk pooling like spilled wine, her diamonds scattered like worthless gravel. The Queen of Tibido lay broken in her own theater of cruelty. A roar went up from below, not of fear but of triumph. Our people raised their chains, their torches, their voices. The arena shook with a single word, a thunderous hymn that rattled the stars. Freedom. The fire climbed higher, devouring the box, the stands, the very stage of our torment. Madame Evangeline's empire crumbled with her body. She had built her legacy on blood, and now it drowned her. I stepped back onto the balcony railing, the flames curling around me, the smoke wrapping me like a cloak. For the first time, I looked down not as a prisoner, not as a gladiator, but as a man who had taken his vengeance. The fire claimed her jewels, her silks, her crown. But her memory would live not in glory but in the whispers of the dead she had tormented, and in the stories of the slaves who had burned her world to the ground. I raised my chain one last time. The links blackened with soot, dripping with the last breath of Tibido's queen. She is gone, I shouted. Her reign is over, and the arena, the swamp, the very night itself answered back with a roar of freedom that shook heaven's gate. When Madame Evangeline's body hit the balcony floor, her empire collapsed with her. The last thread holding the plantation together snapped, and chaos poured into the open like blood from a fresh wound. But there was still work to be done. The masters had fallen, poisoned, gutted, burned. But the overseers remained. Those men who had cracked the whips, who had barked orders while we bent double in the cane fields, who had taken pleasure in carving scars across our backs. They were still alive, and their faces were marked in our memories like brands. "Find them," Marcus growled, his shoulder bleeding, his spear dripping red. His eyes burned hotter than the fire that devoured the bleachers. "No overseer leaves this place alive." The cry spread through us like a spark to dry kindling. Slaves who had been chained only hours before now surged forward with weapons stripped from the dead. Some carried muskets, others clutched knives. Most still bore only chains and farming tools, but their rage made them sharper than steel. The overseers had gathered near the stables, a cluster of armed men surrounded by the last fragments of Tibido's guards. They shouted orders, firing muskets into the smoke. The shots cracked sharp, echoing through the burning arena, and each one dropped one of ours into the sand. But for every brother or sister that fell, 10 more pressed forward. We had lived our lives beneath their whips. Tonight their whips would taste their own blood. I led the charge, the chain swinging from my fist. We struck like thunder rolling across the fields. Marcus's spear flashed beside me, cutting down a guard before the man could reload. Ruth darted forward like a shadow, her knife sinking between the ribs of an overseer who had once dragged her mother into the stocks. Rebecca came behind, leveling a musket at another man's chest and firing point blank, the powder burn scorching his shirt as he collapsed. The overseers fought like men who had never imagined death could find them. They shouted curses, leveled bayonets, swung whips like weapons, but their shouts turned to screams as we closed in. For the first time they faced not broken slaves, but soldiers born of torment. I recognized one among them, Harlan, the scar-faced brute who had overseen the cane fields. He had taken delight in his cruelty, laughing as he cut men down for faltering under the sun. His whip was in his hand now, but when his eyes met mine, the laughter was gone. "Samson," he stammered, the whip dangling useless. "Wait, we can talk." The chain flew before he could finish. It caught his throat with a snap, the iron link sinking into his flesh. I pulled hard, dragging him to his knees, his face purple, his hands clawing. "Talk to the dead," I hissed, and with a final wrench I felt the life tear from him. Around me the slaughter spread. Overseers who had strutted like kings now begged on their knees. Some tried to run, but the fire had penned them in. Others fought until the last, their pistols empty, their bodies hacked down beneath a tide of vengeance. One man fell screaming as Ruth opened his belly, his guts spilling into the mud. Another was dragged by 2 women toward the swamp, where they threw him into the black water. His shrieks echoed until the alligators silenced him forever. Rebecca caught an overseer who had once overseen the breeding yard, a man whose hands had stolen children from their mothers. She carved his face open with a blade, stroke after stroke, until the features that had haunted us were nothing but red ruin. The fire cast everything in shades of hell. The air burned our lungs, sparks rained onto our skin, but we did not stop. This was more than revenge, it was judgment. One by one the overseers fell, their cries mixing with the crack of timber as the arena gave way to flame. The smoke thickened until it seemed the night itself was collapsing, the stars drowned in fire. At last silence fell, not the silence of peace, but the silence of death. The overseers lay scattered across the sand, across the swamp, across the burning grounds of Tibido. Not one remained standing. Marcus leaned on his spear, his chest heaving. Blood streaked his face, his eyes wild. But when he looked at me, a grim smile carved across his mouth. "It's done," he said. Every lash answered, every wound avenged. Rebecca came to stand beside us, her gown torn to rags, her hands blackened with soot and blood. Ruth stood with her knife still clutched, her face set like stone. I looked across the field of ruin, the fire consuming the stands, the swamp swallowing bodies, the arena soaked with blood, and I knew Marcus was wrong. It wasn't done. This was only the beginning. We had cut down the masters, slaughtered the overseers, burned their theater of cruelty to the ground. But beyond these walls stretched plantations just like Tibido's, each with its own chains, its own whips, its own tyrants. The fire that devoured this arena was not an ending. It was a signal, and I swore, standing among the dead, that we would carry that fire into every corner of this land, until no whip cracked, no chain rattled, and no master slept without fear. The overseers lay dead, their screams fading into memory, their whips and muskets scattered in the sand. But the night was not finished. Beyond the arena, beyond the stables, the true symbol of our suffering still loomed, the mansion of Madame Evangelene Tibido. That house was more than timber and brick. It was the crown jewel of her cruelty, a monument to the lives bled dry beneath its shadow. From its polished floors, she had planned her entertainments, sipping wine while we died for her amusement. From its balconies, she had issued commands that sent mothers to the stocks and fathers to the gallows. It was not enough to kill her. The house itself had to die. "Bring the fire," I said, my voice hoarse from smoke. Benjamin, the carpenter whose hands had built much of the place, stepped forward carrying a torch. He stared at the mansion for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I know every board in that house," he murmured. "I know where the frame is weakest, where the wind will carry flame fastest." "Then lead us," Marcus said. We marched toward the mansion like a funeral procession turned inside out. 50 slaves, no longer slaves, each carrying flame blade or chain. The guests who remained alive, no more than 24, were herded before us, forced to witness the ruin of everything they had once praised. The mansion stood tall at the edge of the bayou, its white columns gleaming even under the smoke-stained sky. Spanish moss draped its eaves, swaying in the wind as if beckoning the fire to come. Its windows reflected the blaze from the arena like eyes wide with fear. Benjamin strode to the porch, his torch raised high. "I built you," he said, his voice breaking. He pressed the torch to the dry wood beneath the veranda. In an instant, the flame leapt up, racing along the boards as though it had been waiting all these years. We followed his lead, torches pressed to shutters, to door frames, to the oil-soaked cloth we had carried from the kitchens. The fire spread greedily, racing up the walls, licking the columns, devouring the roof. Inside, the fine curtains caught fire, blooming like flowers of flame. The grand piano in the parlor shrieked as its strings snapped one by one. Oil paintings of long-dead Tibidos curled black and peeled from the walls, their aristocratic faces melting into ash. The guests screamed as the house that had welcomed them so many times became a pyre. "Please," cried a planter's wife, her jeweled necklace glittering in the firelight. "Spare it." "Spare us? Did you spare the families you sold?" Ruth spat, dragging the woman forward to watch her world collapse. "Did you spare the men you sent to the Alligators?" "Watch now, watch and remember." The roof began to groan, timbers cracking under the heat. Sparks shot upward, whirling into the black sky like 1,000 souls rising. The fire roared so loud it drowned out the wailing of the survivors. I stood before the mansion, the heat scorching my face, and felt the weight of 2 years lift from my shoulders. For 2 years, I had fought in Madame Evangeline's arena, killing for her amusement while she sat safe inside this house. Now the house itself writhed like a beast on a spit. Marcus appeared beside me, his massive hands black with soot. "She's gone now," he said, staring into the inferno. "Her house, her name, her power, all ashes." I shook my head. "Not yet," he frowned. "What more is left?" I pointed to the guests huddled nearby, their faces pale, their fine clothes streaked with dirt. "They will carry her memory if we let them live. They'll turn her into a martyr, a saint, a symbol. That house must burn with them inside it, or else her shadow will live on." A murmur ran through our people. Some nodded grimly. Others hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes. To kill overseers and guards was vengeance. To burn women and men of quality alive was something darker. Rebecca spoke then, her voice cold. "These people drank while we bled. They laughed while we died. If they live, they will call us monsters, and the world will believe them. But if they vanish into the same fire that consumed her, then this night will be remembered for what it was. Justice." No one argued after that. We dragged the survivors to the porch, ignoring their pleas. They clutched at us, offered gold, promised mercy. They promised things they had never given. One by one, they were shoved into the burning hall. Their screams mingled with the roar of collapsing beams, their polished shoes slipping on the blazing floorboards. The fire swallowed them whole. The mansion roared as if alive, every window belching smoke, every door a mouth of flame. The columns cracked and toppled inward, crushing whatever remained of Tibido's guests. A final groan echoed through the night, and then the roof caved in with a roar like thunder, sparks exploding into the sky. We stood together watching the inferno. 50 faces illuminated in orange and red, 50 hearts beating with the rhythm of freedom. For the first time, the Tibido mansion was not a palace but a pyre, a monument not to wealth but to the wrath of the enslaved. When at last the walls collapsed, and the house became nothing more than a heap of glowing embers, silence fell. A silence not of fear but of release. The house was gone. Madame Evangeline was gone. The overseers were gone, and the fire had written their names into ash. But deep down I knew, the fire had written our names too, and now the world would come hunting for us. The fire still raged behind us, but we did not linger to watch the mansion's last breaths. Its collapse was certain. What remained uncertain was what we would do with those who had not yet been consumed. Not all of Madame Evangeline's guests had perished in the inferno. A score of them had been rounded up before the blaze reached its peak. Merchants, planters, and their wives, dragged from hiding places in the gardens, the stables, even beneath overturned wagons. They were trembling now, stripped of their jeweled coats and silk gowns, their finery torn and smeared with mud. For the first time in their lives, they looked like prey. We marched them back to the arena, that cursed circle of sand where I had shed so much blood. It felt fitting that judgment should fall there, upon the ground that had drunk the lives of so many slaves. The moon had broken free of the smoke, casting a pale light over the empty stands. The arena smelled of charred flesh and gunpowder, the echoes of screams still clinging to the air. We forced the captives into the pit, the very place where we had once been forced to fight. The irony was not lost on them. I saw it in their eyes, wide and wet, darting around the silent rows of benches where no audience remained to applaud their death. They look smaller now, Marcus said, arms crossed over his chest. His voice carried the rumble of contempt. Stripped of their servants, their guns, their wealth, just men and women, nothing more. Rebecca walked slowly around the pit, her torchlight painting their faces in orange shadows. For years, they came here to watch us slaughter each other like beasts, she said, her voice steady, calm, like a preacher's sermon. Tonight, they will know what it is to be judged by the very ones they condemned. A woman in pearls fell to her knees, clutching at Rebecca's skirt. Please, she begged, her voice shrill. We had no part in the cruelty. It was Madame Evangeline. She forced us to watch. Rebecca's eyes burned. Forced you to watch? Did she force you to clap when a man's skull was split open? Did she force you to wager on which of us would live? You drank wine while children were whipped in the sand. Don't tell me you were forced. The woman collapsed, sobbing, but no one moved to comfort her. We built a pyre in the center of the pit. A stake surrounded by broken furniture and oil-soaked hay dragged from the stables. It rose like a black tooth in the moonlight, a grim pillar of justice. The captives watched in horror, their bodies trembling as the slaves they had once dismissed, as cattle moved with unflinching purpose. When the pyre was ready, I stepped forward. My voice carried across the sand, heavy with the weight of years. For every lash you praised, for every death you cheered, for every family you watched torn apart, tonight you will pay. You are not nobles, not planters, not lords, you are guilty. And the arena that feasted on our blood will now feast on yours, the captives wailed. Some cursed us, others begged. One man, a thick-bellied merchant, tried to lunge at me, spitting rage. Savages, animals, you'll hang for this. I met his eyes without flinching. Perhaps, but first you'll burn. We bound them in pairs, hands tied behind their backs, and forced them to march around the arena. The slaves formed a circle, torches raised high, voices chanting low. It was not words we spoke, but a rhythm, a pulse older than chains, a heartbeat of defiance. One by one, the captives were driven to the pyre. Some resisted, some collapsed, but all were pushed forward. The first pair were tied to the stake, their screams piercing the night. When the torch touched the hay, the fire leapt up eagerly, engulfing them in a crown of flames. Their shrieks carried across the plantation like the echoes of every slave they had ignored, every soul they had dismissed as less than human. The others watched, eyes wide, faces pale with terror. They knew their turn would come. As each pair burned, the air filled with smoke and the sickening smell of roasting flesh. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others, like Rebecca and Marcus, stared unblinking, their faces grim with the weight of justice delivered. Benjamin the carpenter whispered hoarsely beside me, "This is what they deserve, every one of them." But I felt a heaviness in my chest, not of regret but of clarity. We were not just avengers, we were witnesses. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a balancing of scales that had been tilted too long in their favor. The last captive was a man with silver hair and cold eyes. He had not wept, had not begged. He simply stared at me as though daring me to falter. "Your face will haunt me," he said, his voice low, calm, even as his bonds tightened around the stake. "But the world will never hear your side. They will call you devils." I leaned close, so the fire's glow painted my face in red. "Then let them, for tonight devils are what we must be." I thrust the torch into the hay. Flames roared upward, swallowing him whole. His eyes did not close until the fire devoured them. When the last screams faded, silence fell heavy over the arena. The captives were gone, their ashes mingling with the same sand where so many of ours had bled. We stood together, 50 slaves no longer slaves, our faces lit by the dying embers. There was no cheer, no triumph, only a solemn understanding. We had become both executioners and survivors. and as the smoke drifted into the night sky, I knew this was only the beginning. The fire had cleansed this place, but the world beyond still bore the weight of chains, and that world would come for us. The arena was silent now. Nothing left but the crackle of dying embers and the smell of ash. Behind us, the mansion lay in ruins, its charred skeleton sagging against the smoke-filled sky. We had avenged the dead, silenced our tormentors, and erased the Tibido name from the earth. But vengeance does not buy safety. The night still stretched wide before us, and with it the certainty that dawn would bring hunters, soldiers, and hounds. "We cannot stay," Marcus said, his deep voice breaking the heavy quiet. "The smoke will call them here. By morning the parish will know." He was right. Already I imagined riders thundering down the roads, torches in hand, guns at their sides, searching for the slaves who had dared to rise. No, not slaves. Rebels. Runaways. Outlaws. "Then we go where they cannot follow," I said. My eyes turned toward the swamps that hemmed the plantation's far edge, a black tangle of water and trees that seemed to breathe in the moonlight. The bayou was a labyrinth, treacherous and merciless, but it was also our refuge. Few white men dared its depths. Fewer still returned. Rebecca nodded, adjusting the sack slung over her shoulder. "The swamps will hide us," she murmured, "but they'll test us too." We gathered what we could. Knives and muskets scavenged from the overseers, sacks of cornmeal, jugs of water, a scattering of lanterns. Each of us carried less than we wanted, but more than we'd ever owned before. Then, with the fires of Tibido still burning at our backs, we turned our faces toward the bayou and stepped into the darkness. The air grew heavy as we entered the swamp. The cries of crickets and frogs rose like a chorus, masking the sounds of our movement. Cypress trees loomed high, their trunks swollen, their roots tangled in the black water. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds, swaying gently with each breath of wind. The ground was soft beneath our feet, mud sucking at our steps. Some places sank so deep we had to pull one another free, hands gripping arms with desperate strength. The children whimpered, but no one dared raise their voice. Silence was our shield. Every step forward was a reminder of freedom's price. The swamp did not welcome us with open arms. It clawed and pulled, tested our resolve. But we pressed on, for behind us lay chains and death, and ahead, however uncertain, lay only the possibility of life. Hours passed. My muscles screamed with fatigue, my throat raw from smoke and thirst. But I dared not falter, not with so many eyes upon me. To them, I had become more than a fighter in the arena. I was the one who had lived where others died, the one who had carried them through fire and blood. That mantle was heavier than any chain, yet I bore it. At a clearing where the moonlight broke through the canopy, we paused to rest. The water there was shallow, rippling with the slow drift of unseen creatures. A log floated nearby, but Benjamin, ever watchful, hissed for us to stay back. "Not a log," he whispered. "A gator." We froze as the beast slid silently past, its eyes like twin lanterns above the water. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might betray us, but the creature moved on, vanishing into the reeds. Only when it was gone did we breathe again. "God watches us," Ruth whispered, clutching her son close. "He has not brought us this far to let us fall to beasts." But I wondered, did God truly watch? Or was it only us, standing against the world with no promise but what we carved out ourselves? As we pressed deeper, the swamp revealed both menace and mercy. Hidden paths wound between the waters, narrow ridges of earth where the footing held steady. Rebecca guided us along these trails, her memory sharp from childhood days when she had stolen moments of freedom here, gathering herbs and roots. It was she who led us to a small rise, where the ground was dry enough to make camp. There, beneath the shelter of ancient cypress, we gathered in a circle. No fire too dangerous. Instead, we shared cold cornmeal, chewed in silence, each bite a reminder of the hunger to come. The children slept first, their heads on their mothers' laps. Marcus kept watch at the edge of the water, musket across his knees. Rebecca whispered prayers over the weary, and I sat with my back to a tree, listening to the swamp breathe. I thought of the faces of those who had burned, their screams etched into my mind. I thought of Evangelene Tibido, her laughter silenced by the fire, and I thought of what lay ahead. We were not yet free, not truly. We had escaped a plantation, but the world itself was a plantation, its chains waiting beyond every border. And yet, for the first time in years, I felt the air of possibility stir against my skin. No overseer watched me now, no whip cracked. My hands were my own, bloody though they were. Rebecca moved beside me, her eyes glinting in the dark. "You carry the weight heavy, don't you?" she said softly. I nodded. "Too many died tonight. Too many always die," she replied, her voice fierce. "But tonight, for once, they died instead of us." Her words sank deep like roots finding soil. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps vengeance, no matter how bloody, was the only seed from which freedom could grow. Above us the moon broke through again, painting the swamp in silver. The trees swayed, the water rippled, and I felt something shift inside me. We were hunted, yes, but we were alive. And as long as we breathed, the fire that had begun at Tibido's would not die. We would carry it forward, through the swamps, through the bloodhounds, through the world itself if need be. The march had only just begun. The swamp has a way of swallowing sound, of muffling every step and whisper, until even your own breathing feels like blasphemy. For a time that silence comforted me. It wrapped around us like a shroud, hiding our footsteps from the world beyond the cypress and moss. But silence is fragile, and in the dead of night it broke. The first to hear it was Marcus. He stiffened where he crouched at the edge of camp, his great hands tightening on the musket across his knees. I saw the change ripple through him, his chest rising shallow, his eyes cutting toward the distance. Then I heard it too. A howl, faint but sharp, cutting across the swamp like a knife. Not the cry of a wolf, not the mournful song of a swamp dog. No, this was a sound drilled into the marrow of every runaway, the baying of bloodhounds. Fear flickered across the faces of the weary. Mothers clutched their children. Men reached for weapons they had barely learned to wield. The swamp itself seemed to tense, the frogs and crickets falling silent, the water stilling in dread. "They've come," Benjamin whispered. His voice cracked. "The hunters are out." The hounds' howls grew louder, joined by the distant shouts of men. Lanterns flickered faintly in the black distance, their light bobbing like ghost fires. The hunters had wasted no time. By now, word of Tibido's ruin must have spread like fire through dry grass. They weren't chasing slaves. They were chasing rebels, killers who had left a plantation in flames. "We move now," I said. My voice was steady, though my chest burned with panic. "Gather the children. Stay close. The swamp is our only shield." We left the rise in silence, slipping back into the labyrinth of mud and water. The moon guided us, casting pale reflections across the dark pool. They had been raised to follow the scent of sweat, fear, and desperation. They had been loosed upon countless runaways before us. But we were not runaways. We were an army, ragged though we were, and we would not be taken alive. Marcus moved at the rear, his bulk a wall of protection. Rebecca led the front, her keen eyes finding paths where the water thinned and the roots held firm. I stayed at the center, listening, weighing every sound. Then came the splash, the unmistakable crash of men entering the swamp. Voices rang out sharp and commanding, fan wide, their close. Lanterns bobbed through the trees, their light spilling across the water in trembling lines. The howls turned frenzied. The hounds at our trail. "Run!" I hissed. The swamp exploded with motion. Children were hoisted onto shoulders, women dragged through the mud by strong hands. Men stumbled and rose again. Branches tore at our arms. Water sucked at our legs, but still we pushed forward. Behind us the baying closed in. Then, a scream. One of the hounds had reached us. It lunged from the dark, a beast of muscle and teeth, its slavering jaws fastening on the leg of young Isaiah, barely 16. He fell with a cry, the dog thrashing, tearing flesh. I was on it before thought could form. My blade plunged down once, twice, 3 times. Hot blood spurted, staining the swamp water red. The hound released its grip, collapsing with a final growl. Isaiah's leg was shredded, but he was alive. Marcus lifted him onto his back without a word, and we kept moving. The hunters' shouts grew near. Muskets cracked, shots whistling through the trees. A branch splintered above my head. Another ball hissed into the water at my side. They were firing blind, but blind shots could still kill. We veered off the path, plunging into deeper water. The swamp swallowed us waist deep, then chest deep. We struggled through it, the children clinging to necks, the weak pulled along by stronger arms. Each step was a battle against the swamp itself, and all the while the baying grew louder. Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos. "This way, I know a place." We followed her toward a stand of cypress, where the roots twisted into a natural barricade. Beneath them, the water opened into a hollow, hidden and shadowed. We crammed inside, bodies pressed together, water rising to our shoulders. "Quiet," I whispered. The swamp obeyed. Moments later, the hunters arrived. Lantern light spilled across the water, casting long shadows through the cypress roots. The hound surged forward, sniffing, splashing, whining with confusion. One barked furiously, but its handler yanked it back. "They went this way," a man shouted. "Spread out, flush 'em." Another barked. We held our breath as the men waded past, their boots sloshing within arm's reach. The hounds whined, tugging at their leashes, but the roots concealed us well. A lantern passed so close I could see the sweat on the man's face. hear the rasp of his breathing. I prayed, not to the God of the whites, but to the spirits of those who had burned in the arena. Let their ghosts mislead the hounds. Let their ashes blind the hunters. Minutes dragged like hours. At last the men moved on, their voices fading, their lanterns shrinking to fireflies in the dark. The hounds' baying grew distant. We did not move until silence claimed the swamp once more. Then Rebecca exhaled a long, trembling sigh. "They'll be back," Marcus muttered. His arms were stiff with Isaiah's weight, but his eyes burned with resolve. "We can't keep hiding, we'll need to fight." I nodded, though my heart sank. The swamp had shielded us tonight. But the hunters would not tire. They would come again with more men, more hounds, more fire. And when they came, we would have to meet them with more than fear. By dawn, the swamp had become our world. Its green-gray silence wrapped around us, masking us from the patrols that beat the ground beyond. We were no longer moving blindly. We were hunted, yes, but we had also learned. The swamp was no friend, but it was no enemy either. It was a tool, and if wielded wisely, it could be a weapon. Rebecca was the first to say it aloud. "They'll be back before nightfall," she whispered as we crouched in a shallow hollow ringed by cypress knees. "More hounds, more men. If we keep running, they'll run us into the ground. We must make them bleed." Her words were dangerous. To fight in the arena had been survival. To fight the patrols was open war. Yet I saw in the eyes of those gathered around me that she spoke the truth. Running would kill us faster than bullets. Marcus nodded, his bulk looming like a carved idol in the half-light. "We make a stand here. They expect prey. We'll show them hunters." So we began. The swamp provided everything. Branches hardened to spears, vines strong as rope, pits of black mud that could swallow a manhole. Benjamin the carpenter led the work, his hands steady even in exhaustion. He showed us how to sharpen branches, how to weave vines into snares, how to shape the swamp itself into a trap. We worked without pause. Mothers carried mud in baskets, children gathered rocks, men hacked branches with stolen blades. The swamp rang with the quiet rhythm of preparation, the heartbeat of desperation forged into resolve. By midday, Cypress Hollow had become a fortress. A pit had been dug near the narrow entrance, camouflaged with leaves and reeds. Spear traps waited in the shallows, their points aimed upward, hidden beneath the water's sheen. Stones and logs were piled high above the path, ready to be toppled with a single shove. And in the very heart of the hollow, we left a fire pit bare and waiting, a lure for men who thought themselves clever. When the work was done, we crouched in silence, waiting. Every ear strained for the sound that would tell us the hunt had returned. It came with the setting sun. The baying began again, louder now, more insistent. The hounds had our scent once more, and their masters followed close. Lanterns flickered in the distance, bobbing like malevolent stars. The air thickened with the smell of tobacco smoke and sweat carried on the wind. "They're coming," Marcus growled. We tightened our grips on spears and muskets, hearts hammering, breath shallow. The swamp itself seemed to hold its breath with us, the insects falling silent, the frogs stilled. The first hounds burst into the clearing, tongues lolling, eyes gleaming. Behind them came men. 6 at first, muskets ready, knives at their belts. They advanced cautiously, scanning the shadows, unaware of the eyes watching them from every angle. The lead hunter spotted the fire pit. He grinned, calling back to his fellows. They were here not long ago. He stepped forward, onto the camouflaged pit. The ground gave way beneath him, and with a scream he vanished, impaled on sharpened stakes below. His companions lunged forward in shock, but their boots slid in mud slick with swamp water. Spears whistled from the shadows, striking 2 men in the chest. The hounds snarled, lunging wildly, but Benjamin and Isaiah leapt from the trees above, knives flashing. One hound fell with its throat cut, another with a spear through its rib. The hunters fired blindly, the musket's blasts echoing through the swamp. One shot grazed Ruth's shoulder, but she did not falter. From above, Rebecca shoved with all her strength. The piled logs and stones tumbled down the slope, crashing into the clearing. 2 hunters were crushed beneath the avalanche, their bodies broken and twisted. The survivors screamed, scrambling back, but the swamp offered no retreat. Spears flew. Knives flashed. In minutes, the hollow was painted with blood. The last hunter standing tried to flee, his lantern swinging wildly as he splashed into the shallows, but Marcus caught him by the collar, dragging him back as he kicked and screamed. I stepped forward, my blade raised. The man's eyes widened, his face smeared with mud and fear. "Please," he begged, "I'm just a hired man. I've no quarrel with you." I thought of the arena, of the slaves who had begged for mercy under his gaze while he leaned on the fence with a grin. I thought of the women he had dragged to the stables, of the men he had whipped for amusement. "No quarrel," I hissed. "Then take this as your answer." My blade sank into his chest, silencing him forever. When it was done, the swamp was quiet again, save for the groans of the dying and the bubbling of disturbed waters. Our people gathered together, weary but unbroken. The traps had worked. We had not only survived, we had triumphed. Rebecca's eyes shone in the torchlight. They'll think twice before stepping into the swamp again, or they'll return with more, Marcus warned, wiping blood from his arms. I looked to the horizon, where the last light of day bled into night. He was right. We had won a battle, but the war was not finished. Each stand we made only bought us time, but time was enough. Each hour we lived was another chance, another step toward a freedom we had never known. And so we prepared to march again, deeper into the bayou, where no road could follow. The swamp does not forget. Long after the screams of the patrolmen had faded into silence, Cypress Hollow whispered with the memory of death. The trees stood like sentinels, their limbs draped in moss that swayed though no wind stirred. The water, dark and glassy, carried the sheen of blood in its ripples. Every step through the muck seemed to awaken something. An echo of the lives taken here, of the chains broken, of the vengeance yet to come. Some said it was imagination, born of exhaustion and fear, but I knew better. I had seen too much, shed too much blood to believe the swamp was empty. It was alive, ancient, watching. At night, when the stars blinked through gaps in the canopy, I could hear voices, faint at first like the hum of insects. But as the hours stretched on, they grew clearer. Whispers in tongues I did not know, songs sung by throats long since turned to dust. Sometimes I heard chains rattling in the distance, though none among us wore irons any longer. The others heard it too. Rebecca confessed one evening, her face pale in the firelight. "I dreamed of my mother," she whispered. She stood at the edge of the water, her arms outstretched. She said the swamp would guard us, but only if we gave it something in return. Marcus scoffed, but even he could not hide the way his eyes flicked to the shadows when the wind moaned through the cypress. "Dreams," he muttered, yet his grip on his blade was tighter than before. The children spoke of shapes in the trees, faces with hollow eyes watching from the moss. One boy swore he had seen a hand rise from the water and brush his ankle before vanishing. He wept as he told it, and none of us laughed. For me, the ghosts were more familiar. I saw the arena each time I closed my eyes. I heard the roar of the crowd, the ring of steel, the pleading voices of those who begged for mercy. I felt the weight of the last man I killed before our flight. The way his breath rattled, the way his eyes dimmed, these memories were ghosts enough, and the swamp seemed eager to remind me of them. But the strangest moment came 3 nights after the battle. We had moved deeper into the bayou, setting camp on a patch of high ground where the water lay in still pools around us. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of wet earth. As I kept watch, I saw a glow among the trees. Not the steady burn of a torch, but a pale shifting light, like moonlight captured in a jar. I rose, weapon in hand, and crept closer. The light swirled ahead of me, always just beyond reach. It led me past roots and reeds, past pools that reflected the stars. My breath grew shallow, my heart steady but heavy. Finally, in a small clearing, the light gathered and shaped itself. There before me stood a woman. Her skin was dark as mine, her hair bound in a wrap of faded cloth. Her eyes, deep and mournful, bore into me with a weight that rooted me to the spot. She was not flesh, but shadow and flame, shimmering like heat rising from stone. "You carry too much blood on your hands," she said, not with her lips, but with a voice that filled my head like thunder. I tried to speak, but no sound left me. "Blood feeds the swamp," she continued. "It remembers every drop. Every man, woman, and child who perished here lingers in its breath. You walk among them now." I lowered my gaze, my chest tight. "Then what must I do?" I whispered at last. "Carry their memory," she said. "Do not let their pain die with their bodies. Use it, wield it. Let their chains be your weapon." The light flickered, her shape dissolving like smoke in the air. In the space she had stood, the swamp was still once more. I staggered back to camp, my body trembling. When Rebecca saw me, she said nothing, only looked into my eyes and nodded, as if she already knew. From then on, I began to see the swamp differently. Not as a prison, nor as a battlefield, but as a graveyard. And in that graveyard, the dead had chosen to rise beside us. Every trap we laid felt guided by unseen hands. Every step we took through the mud felt cushioned by voices urging us forward. When the night fell thick and suffocating, the whispers soothed the children to sleep. We were not alone. The bayou had become haunted, yes, but it was haunted in our favor. And though fear still clung to us, though every rustle in the brush quickened our hearts, there was a new fire in our veins. We knew then that the swamp was not merely hiding us. It was fighting with us, The ghosts of the bayou had chosen their side. Freedom is a fragile thing. We carried it like embers cupped in our hands. One careless breath, and it could vanish into smoke. For weeks now we had survived the swamp, the patrols, the hounds, even our own despair. But survival came at a price. And among us was one who began to weigh freedom against his fear, and found it too heavy to carry. His name was Elijah. He was not the strongest nor the weakest, but he had always been restless. In the campfire's glow he spoke often of what might come after, of houses with open doors, of food without toil, of laughter without shadows. But he also asked too many questions about routes, about watchers, about when and where we might move. At first I thought it was eagerness. Later, I saw the cracks in his resolve. It was Ruth who warned me first. She approached one evening as the children slept and the swamp hummed around us. "He's talking to himself," she whispered, glancing toward Elijah, who sat apart from the others. "I heard him muttering last night. Names, promises, begging the Lord or maybe someone else." Rebecca overheard and frowned. "The swamp tests us all," she said. "But if his spirit breaks, he could undo us." I did not want to believe it. I had seen Elijah fight beside us, his blade red with the blood of the men who hunted us. But fear can twist even the bravest. 2 nights later, I caught him slipping from camp. I followed at a distance, moving silent through the reeds. The moon lit his path as he walked faster, glancing over his shoulder as though shadows chased him. At last he stopped at the edge of a clearing, where the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water. There he fell to his knees. "I'll do it," he whispered into the darkness. "I'll lead you to them, just let me live. Give me safe passage, and I'll bring you all their heads." His words struck me like a blow. He wasn't speaking to God, he was speaking to the hunters. And though no man stood before him, the swamp carried his voice as if it begged the dead themselves. I stepped from the shadows. Elijah, he spun, his eyes wide, face pale. "Brother," he stammered. I was only what?" I demanded. My voice was low, but it carried all the fury of betrayal. "Only offering our lives for your safety." He backed away, his hands trembling. "You don't understand, they'll come again in greater numbers. We can't fight forever. But if I give them what they want, if I lead them, I'll live. Maybe they'll let some of you live too." Rebecca and Marcus emerged from the brush, drawn by our voices. Elijah's face crumpled when he saw them, his lies stripped bare. "You'd sell us," Marcus growled, his voice like thunder. "After all, we've bled together. I want to live," Elijah cried, tears cutting tracks in the mud on his cheeks. "Is that so wrong? To want breath in my lungs, to want a life without running?" I stared at him, my hand tightening on the hilt of my blade. Part of me wanted to strike him down then and there to silence his treachery before it could bloom. But another part remembered his laughter, his song sung softly to the children, his courage in the first days of flight. He was not evil, he was broken. Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes hard. "If you lead them to us, none of us will live, not even you. They don't want survivors, Elijah. They want trophies." Her words seemed to pierce him deeper than any blade. He sagged to his knees, sobbing into his hands. We did not kill him that night, but neither did we trust him again. Marcus bound his wrists with vines, and we set a guard to watch him. Some whispered that it was too great a risk, that he should be left for the swamp to claim. Others said mercy was the only thing separating us from the hunters. I felt the weight of their eyes upon me, waiting for my judgment. At last I spoke. "We are not the masters who broke us. We are not their whips, nor their chains. If we kill every soul who falters, then we are no different than the men who hunt us." But I added, my voice sharpening, "If he betrays us again, the swamp will take him, and I will be the one to deliver him." Elijah said nothing, only wept until exhaustion dragged him into uneasy sleep. From then on, the group carried his shame like a shadow. Trust-frayed whispers spread. Even the children sensed the shift. One traitor could doom us all, and every rustle in the night reminded us of it. The swamp still whispered, the ghosts still guided, but now another enemy had entered our ranks. Doubt, and doubt I knew could be deadlier than any musket. Word moves faster than any rider. By the time the sun had climbed a day or two above the pines, the smoke from Tibido had already painted the horizon for miles, a black wound that every planter and overseer read like a summons. They sent riders in anger and fear, and with those riders came names, neighbors, men who had laughed in Evangelene's box, men who had bet on our deaths and called it sport. They're the ones I wanted to see tremble. We could not rest. Hiding in the swamp brought us a heartbeat, but not safety. The South would not let Tibido's ruins stand without an answer. Patrols would spread, militias would form, and they would not stop at the bayou. If the fire of Tibido was to mean anything, it had to spread. Not as mindless arson, but as a message. Burn their symbols, free their people if we could, take supplies, and leave them something to remember. Benjamin drew the map in the stale light of a hidden lean-to, pointing with a charred stub of wood. Garland's place is nearest. He sits like a vulture, trading in boys and girls to stock his crews. They've a small guard, less than a dozen, and a barn full of brand-new irons. Marcus spat. Then we take him first. We moved at dusk, a rope of shadows skimming between fields, avoiding the main roads where riders might sweep. The plantations at night smell of molasses and manure, but to me they also smelled of the same rot, money soaked in blood. We crept close enough to hear men snoring under lantern light, the lazy clink of coins in pockets they thought safe. At the edge of the first yard we split into teams. Rebecca and Ruth went to the kitchens and pressed a quiet handful of men into freeing the stable boys. Benjamin led a small party to the barns to smash the irons and take what tools we could use. Marcus and I would hit the house and the overseer. The plan was simple. Move fast, make noise only where necessary, and leave the place a ruin and everyone who profited from it feeling the same hunger and fear they had inflicted on others. We struck like thunder. Marcus burst through the back door with a club that had once been a maul. The overseer never knew what hit him. Ruth and Rebecca opened the slave quarters and urged who they could into the shadows, the ones still trusting enough to follow. Some froze, eyes wide, unable to believe hands that had once served were now their liberators. We did not have time for speeches. There would be plenty of time later to explain hope. Garland's men tried to rally, but their show of force fell apart under our law. The guards were fewer than Benjamin had said, and mostly old or drunk. One by one they went down, knocked out, stabbed, or given a choice to run. The ones who lived would carry our warning. The ones who did not, those who had chosen cruelty, were left where they fell. We freed as many as we could. Boys rubbing sleep from their eyes stumbled into the mud, baffled and blinking at the night sky as if seeing it new. Mothers clutched children and fled into the edges of the woods with the same fearful gratitude I had seen in Rebecca's face when we had first planned this. They were not all with us. Many could not go, not yet. But we took what we could. Food, a few horses, a cache of clothing. Everything we could carry we took. Before we left, Benjamin set the barn alight. The fire ate through the stocks. The metal glowed and the air took on the acrid scent of melted leather. The flames climbed and Garland's ledger, pages of names, went black and curled into nothing. Marcus spat on the ashes. Let them count those names in the morning, he said. Let them learn. Let them fear. We moved on, driven by the same logic and hunger. At each place, the method was the same. Strike the overseers, free those who could run with us, steal what would sustain us, and burn the symbols of their power. Ledgers, branding irons, chests with account books. We were surgical and savage at once, sparing those too weak to follow, while making sure those who profited found their foundations undone. Not everyone agreed with what we did. Some among us wanted to leave survivors as warning. Others argued for total annihilation of every man who had ever whipped a child. I walked that brittle line between vengeance and necessity all night. Every ledger I watched burn reminded me of faces. Friends eaten by alligators, Thomas's eyes, Caesar's slow fall. Those faces kept my hand steady when mercy wanted to reach out. When the last plantation fell behind us in a tumble of sparks and smoke, dawn found us broken and heavy with what we had done, and stronger somehow for the decisions we had made. The freed clutched at us, trembling but alive. Others we had no room to bring, fled to forests and hollows with the skein of hope we had left them. We had not smote every tyrant in the region, that was impossible, but we had shown them a new equation. Oppression could be answered, and those who feasted on our blood could be cooked by their own fires. We divided the spoils and set a small group to teach the newly free how to navigate, how to smear trails, how to fake scents. A handful would stay a while, to guide runaways north and carry word to distant networks. The rest of us pushed further into the wilds, toward the river and the route that would lead us north, toward Canada, where chains held no law. As we walked away from the last burning field, the smoke behind us was not only a funeral pyre, but a signal flag unfurled into the sky. It said what we had become, not merely retribution, but an insurgent tide. They would hunt us harder now. They would call us monsters in papers and pulpit, but they would also whisper our names in fear. I did not know how many of us would live to see freedom. I knew only that every field we set aflame carved a path for others to follow. a scorched map of possibility. We would be hunted, yet we would be damned in the mouths of men who still thought themselves right. But for those we freed, for the children who would not be sold again, the risk would be worth it. We moved north with a taste of smoke in our mouths, and the taste of something else too, bitter, bright, and new. It was not yet freedom, not truly, but it was the first clean step toward it. The North was not promised. It was whispered like a prayer, spoken in hushed tones beneath the crack of whips, painted in fragments of rumor. Canada, a place where chains had no law, where men and women of our color walked unbound. Whether it was true I did not know. But after Tibido, after the swamp, after the burning of Garland's fields, we had no choice but to chase the promise. The river was our road, wide, dark, relentless. We stole flatboats, patched rafts from cypress logs and drifted by night, poling the current with quiet strokes. The stars above were our compass, and the whispers of the swamp still carried in our ears, urging us forward. Each mile north pulled us further from the reach of the patrols, though not from danger. Slave catchers moved along the banks, rifles glinting under torchlight, their hounds pacing the shoreline. We kept low, still as stone, our hearts thrumming as boats slid past, their riders muttering about the devils risen from Tibido's pit. They spoke of us with fear now. That fear was our cloak. Weeks blurred together in a rhythm of silence and motion. Hunger gnawed, wounds festered, but the fire in our chest burned brighter than our body's weakness. For every mile we drifted, the air seemed to change, less thick, less poisoned by the stench of ownership. In the Free States, we were told, men would still hate us, but they could not own us. That alone was worth the struggle. Elijah walked with us still, wrists no longer bound but spirit still broken. He had not betrayed us again, though he rarely spoke. I sometimes caught him staring north with hollow eyes, as if wondering if the freedom we sought would forgive the weakness he had shown. I did not know the answer. Perhaps none of us did. When we reached the borders of Kentucky, the land began to shift. Plantations thinned, towns grew closer, and danger was greater for every face that might recognize us. Underground paths stretched ahead, though broken and uncertain. It was then we learned the full measure of what we had become. Strangers met us in barns and cellars, hands trembling as they passed bread and blankets. They knew who we were. The whispers had flown ahead of us like birds. They called me the gladiator of Tibido, called Marcus the hammer, called Rebecca the torch. They knew our names, though we had never given them. To some, we were saviors. To others, nightmares. But either way, they opened their doors, risking lash and noose to move us along. The rebellion had not ended at Tibido's walls. It was rippling outward, carried on smoke and story. Not all of us made it. Ruth fell to fever 3 days past the Ohio. Her breath shallow as a child clutched her hand. We buried her in silence, the river carrying her memory north. Marcus was wounded in a clash with bounty men. He bled for 2 days before rising again, pale but unbroken. Others slipped away into towns, taking new names, starting new lives on whatever soil would have them. I pressed forward. For months, through mud and forest, through fear and fire, I pressed forward, until at last, one morning, the river stretched wide, and on the far bank a sign stood not written in ink, but in the way men carried themselves. No whips, no chains, no overseers barking commands, just men, just women, living, working, unshackled. Canada. When my foot first touched that soil, I did not shout. I did not weep. I only stood, breathing, feeling the weight slide from my shoulders like a stone I'd carried too long. The others crowded behind me, their eyes wide, their faces trembling. For the first time, we were not prey. We were not fugitives. We were simply alive. But freedom does not erase scars. In the nights that followed, I still woke to the sound of chains in my ears, to the roar of the crowd in Tibido's pit, to the sight of Evangelene's smile as she tossed another life into the dirt. Freedom could not silence them, but it gave me something greater. The power to tell the tale, to remember, to pass it on. Years later, when I was old, and my hands no longer steady, I told children who had never seen a whip about Tibido's rise and Tibido's fall. I told them of Rebecca's fire, of Marcus's hammer, of Ruth's quiet strength. I told them of the swamp that became a graveyard and a sanctuary. I told them of Elijah, whose weakness nearly doomed us, yet who walked beside us still. I told them so they would know that freedom was not given. It was taken, fought for, bled for. It was carved into the land by men and women who refused to bow again. And when the children asked if I regretted the blood, if the dead haunted me still, I answered truthfully, yes, they haunt me every night, but I would rather walk with their ghosts in freedom than live among the living in chains. The rebellion at Tibido was not the end. It was the beginning. a spark in dry grass, a flame that would spread across generations. They may bury us, they may try to silence us, but the fire remains. The swamp remembers, the river remembers, I remember, and as long as one voice rises to tell it, so will the world.